We're now going to look at some of the more prominent and more promising arguments that support cultural relativism. And if you'll recall, cultural relativism is the view that an act is right when the majority of the culture approves of it, and an act is wrong when the majority of the culture disapproves of it. There are different ways of arguing for cultural relativism, and there are lots of arguments out there. The ones we're going to focus on are primarily an attack on the main opponent to cultural relativism, the main moral theory that the cultural relativist has to combat, which is called moral objectivism. So these arguments try to show that moral objectivism is implausible or has serious problems, and if that's the case, the idea is, well then cultural relativism is left standing as the most viable, most plausible moral theory. So what is moral objectivism? That's going to be a view that we look at in detail later on. Right now we just want to give you a sketch of what moral objectivism looks like. So that way when we look at the arguments the cultural relativist is giving that support cultural relativism by attacking objectivism, you'll have some idea how those arguments go. It'll make sense to you why those objections are framed the way that they are. To talk about what moral objectivism is, it's probably best to begin by trying to identify or define what an objective fact or an objective truth is. What's the difference between an objective and a subjective truth? There are objective truths. You're committed to them. I'm committed to them. Something exists objectively if its existence doesn't depend on my thoughts or feelings toward it. Or something is an objective truth if it is true regardless of how I think or feel about it. So objective truths and objective facts are ones that exist out there in the world. And they're not ones that in any way depend on how I'm feeling at the moment or how the culture is feeling. Whether we like them or dislike them is irrelevant to those facts or truths. A subjective truth or a subjective fact is one that exists in such a way that it depends on how we think or feel about something. Our attitude towards something, in a sense, determines what the fact is, what state of affairs obtains. Objective facts may sound mysterious, but they're facts that you're very familiar with, ones that you're exposed to all the time. All the truths about the physical world are basically objective facts, like the fact that trees exist, or that you exist, or that a certain battle took place on a certain date in the past. Facts about history are objective. The laws of nature are objective facts. We didn't make them up. We didn't invent them. They were there. We discovered them. So how we think or feel about, say, gravity has no effect on whether objects fall at 9.8 meters per second squared. Facts about math, the truths of math, are objective. You can't change mathematical truths just by wanting to, or wanting them to be a certain way, or by disliking, let's say, triangles. You can't make the geometry of triangles, change in any way. Subjective facts. When people say beauty is in the eye of the beholder, they're saying beauty is a subjective fact. That whether something is beautiful has nothing to do with what's going on out there in the world with regard to the object being judged or evaluated. It has to do with what's going on really inside you. To judge a piece of artwork beautiful is really to talk more about you and your attitude toward the artwork, how the artwork makes you feel, as opposed to just talking about the work of art. So people think that beauty, whether something is beautiful, is a subjective fact. When we say something is cool, they're not cool in the temperature sense, but cool as in those jeans are cool. If you say to your friend shows you their new jeans, you say, yeah, those are cool. Is coolness something that exists out there in the world to be discovered? Is it a genuine feature of the jeans? Or when you describe the jeans as cool, are you talking more about yourself than the jeans? To say the jeans are cool is another way of saying, hey, I like those jeans. I wish I had those jeans. Jeans aren't objectively cool. They're cool because of our attitude toward them. Whether water feels hot or cold or lukewarm is a subjective fact. The temperature of water isn't a subjective fact, it's an objective fact. But how it feels is subjective. So for instance, you are outside on a especially cold day in Minnesota, and you come in and there's a bowl of lukewarm water on the countertop, and you dip your hands into it, and it won't feel lukewarm, it'll feel hot. Now the water isn't temperature-wise hot, but it does feel hot. And so that sensation that the water causes in you is a sort of subjective fact. It really depends on you, not about on the water. It's really sort of a relation between you and the water and how the water affects you. If an objective fact is a fact that exists regardless of how we think or feel about it, if it's a fact that we don't make up or determine, but is there regardless of our attitudes toward it, moral objectivism is going to be the view that moral facts are just a species of objective facts. They too are the sorts of things that we don't determine, either by the culture approving of something or individually. What is objectively right or wrong is right or wrong regardless of how you or I think or feel about it. One way of saying this is that moral objectivism is committed to the existence of universal moral truths. And these are moral truths that apply to all people at all times. Note, the moral objectivist is not saying that everyone at all times have agreed in their moral beliefs. They're just saying that the fact that promise keeping is right is a universal moral truth that applies to all people at all times. Just because someone at an earlier time in the existence of human beings said promise keeping is evil and wrong, that wouldn't make their claim true. Their claim would still be false, because it's a universal moral truth that applies to all people at all times. So whether we should keep our promises has nothing to do with how you or I feel about promise keeping. We can't alter the fact that promise keeping is a good thing by agreeing that it's evil and pernicious. In fact, if everyone since the inception of the universe had believed that, say, giving to the poor, helping to the poor, is morally evil and repugnant, and just about the most awful thing you could possibly do, the objectivist is going to say that has no effect on the fact that helping the poor is good. Even if everyone were to believe it's evil, it would still be right. It would still be a good thing. So moral truths for the objectivist are more like the truth that I've been alive for more than 5 minutes than the truth that the water in my bowl is hot. The fact that I've been alive for more than 5 minutes is an objective fact, not something that depends on us in any way and our attitude toward that fact. But whether the water in a bowl feels hot depends primarily on you. So if you come in from outside and it's very cold outside and you put your hands in a bucket of water and it feels incredibly hot, but then a friend of yours comes in and they were playing racquetball indoor for hours and they put their hand in the same bucket of water, it will feel hot to you but cool to them. The cultural relativist thinks morality is a lot like that, but the moral objectivist says no. Moral truths are kind of like moral laws or scientific laws. There are these universal scientific laws that apply to all people at all times. Just because a culture refuses to acknowledge the existence of gravity doesn't cause that law of science or that law of nature to change. And the same is true, says the objectivist, for morality. There are moral truths that exist and apply to people regardless of whether they choose to accept them or acknowledge them. In other words, for the objectivist, we don't invent or create what's right or wrong. For the cultural relativist, we do in a sense. We kind of make up what's right or wrong by the majority approving of something. For the objectivist, things are already right or wrong. Our job is not to make them up and invent them, but rather to discover them, since they're already there. Since moral objectivism is the view that acts are right or wrong regardless of how we think or feel about them, the cultural relativist is going to argue that there's something very mysterious in the objectivist view, that the view just isn't tenable. And when you take the history of the universe and the way we go about forming our moral beliefs and so on, they think that the picture that the moral objectivist paints doesn't match up with reality. So one thing the cultural relativists worry about is that if there were these objective moral facts, how could we know them? A lot of cultural relativists have an empiricist bent to them, or a sort of radical form of empiricism where they think all knowledge, all genuine, legitimate knowledge, is acquired through the senses. And so, if there's no way we could explain, there's no way the objectivists could tell us how we could discover moral truths using, say, the methods of science, well then how could they be known in the first place? Wouldn't it all just be a matter of opinion and guess? When we look out to the world, and we talk about how we go about acquiring knowledge of the physical world, there is no room in there, it seems, for knowledge of objective moral facts. If we could know objective moral facts, then wouldn't the scientists have already discovered them a long time ago? Scientists continue to make progress and continue to plumb the depths of reality of the physical world, and yet they haven't run across moral rightness or wrongness yet, which suggests maybe there isn't an objective moral fact out there to be known. It's not out there in the world, it's here, in our attitudes of approval and disapproval. Specifically, it's in the culture. The culture determines what's right or wrong. What would these objective moral facts be like? This is related to the first objection. How could we know them? And it seems hard to explain how we could know them, because it's hard to explain what in the world they could be like in the first place. You can't stumble over an objective moral fact. You can't scoop some up. You can't stub your toe into an objective moral fact. Where would these things be in the physical world? Where would they reside? It just seems like a mysterious, spooky type of entity. When you think about it, what we observe with the senses is only what is the case. We only observe what is the case about our world. We never observe what ought to be the case. We talk about what ought to be the case or what should happen, but that's not something we observe, it's something we infer from what we observe, and what we observe is always what is the case about our world. So if you never observe this ought, this truth that some things ought to be one way and some things ought to be another, maybe it's because they're not out there to observe. And they're not out there to observe because there just isn't a place for them in this physical universe. And perhaps the main objection that cultural relativists use against objectivism is the fact that there doesn't seem to be a clear way to resolve our moral differences. When we talk about scientific issues or mathematical issues, issues in history and politics, well, perhaps not politics, but there always seems to be some way of achieving a consensus, even if it takes a long time. There seems to be some method that could be used that helps us achieve some type of agreement. But when it comes to morality, it doesn't seem like there's anything we could do to help achieve agreement. Isn't that why people say, well, that's just your opinion? When they talk about moral issues, they charge others with just expressing their opinion. Why? Well, what they're saying is, it's not something you could really know, it's just an idea or belief you have, but it's not something that we could actually argue about logically and disagree about, and then verify who's got the right belief and who's got the wrong one. Maybe the reason it's so difficult to resolve moral disagreements is because we think we're debating about objective moral truths when those things don't even exist. We're disagreeing about something that is not even there. No wonder we can't agree on in our moral judgments, because we're basing our moral judgments on something that the cultural relativist says doesn't even exist in the first place. Think about it, if cultural relativism is true, there is a clear way to resolve our moral differences. You just take a poll. You want to know whether abortion is right or wrong? Take a poll. If the majority approve of abortion, abortion is morally permissible. if on the next day the majority disapprove of abortion, abortion becomes wrong. There's less mystery involved here. So maybe the reason there are all these problems surrounding discussion of moral issues is that we've all implicitly committed to some sort of objectivism. This idea that there are these universal moral truths that exist independently of you and our culture and me and my culture. And the reason we can't get agreement is because we're trying to find something that isn't even there. So if we're both looking for something and we can't see it because it's not there, what we're really doing is probably just imagining that we're seeing some objective truth, and that the other person, they think they're the ones seeing some objective truth. And the cultural relativists would say, look, stop focusing on what's out there in the world, because moral truths exist in the culture. The culture is the standard of what's right or wrong. The culture determines whether abortion is morally permissible or morally wrong. So one of the main arguments for cultural relativism are not necessarily a defense of cultural relativism directly, but they try to defend cultural relativism indirectly by attacking the main opponent of relativism, which is moral objectivism. So you've got relativist views, and we'll look at another kind of relativist view next called subjectivism. And then you've got all these objectivist views, and they're the two main categories, relativists and objectivists. And relativists say, look, objectivism is implausible, so you should be a relativist. Whether objectivism is implausible is something we'll look at when we talk about moral objectivism.